This is JadeCast, your gateway to traditional martial arts and Chinese culture. Brought to you by your host, Shifu Jonathan Bluestein. Pete Larking, welcome, my
Hey,
friend.
how's it going? Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we've got a special guest today, all the way from faraway New Zealand. Tell us, Pete, how's the martial arts scene in New Zealand?
Well, my experience of it started quite early on, about 25 years ago. So there wasn't really much of one at all, to be fair, outside of maybe a little bit of your sort of a classic sort of Muay Thai kickboxing or karate or something like that. But it's grown and expanded significantly in that time, partly due to more immigration, of course. So just bringing up people from overseas. But also, I suppose because it's quite a small country, small population, only 5 million people, you get to know everyone in the scene a little bit. So, we've got quite a healthy, good internal martial arts community going on now across most of the standard systems that you would commonly find outside of China in this day and age. And there's been some great leaders in the community over the years. Some have passed on, particularly my main tutor, since that time, but they left a big impact on the martial arts community here.
All right. We would get to talking about your teachers in a moment. I would just like to ask you, New Zealand is attracting a lot of people from Southeast Asia and especially China. How do you find or feel that Chinese people and Chinese culture are treated in New Zealand as compared with, say, in North America?
Well, look, I mean, in the context of spending a lot of time with Chinese people, there's probably two answers to that. They love living here. Most of the people that are coming here are purposely leaving China, which is of interest unto itself. And there's two parts to it. I think there's an inherent uneasiness in the New Zealand culture around the importation of East Asian culture into New Zealand initially, particularly when I was a kid. There were no Chinese kids at school. Let's put it that way. But in the last 20 years, there's been a significant lift in the population, particularly up in the northern part of New Zealand in Auckland. And so they've established a strong community of their own, which is obviously critical. And New Zealand's embraced a lot of the Chinese culture in that context. We have big sort of Chinese New Year festivals, all that sort of carry on. So I think the integration's actually gone quite well. We do live in a very multicultural culture here. In the context, there's a lot of Pacific Island communities as well. And New Zealand is essentially an immigrated country, apart from our indigenous Maori culture. So none of us really totally belong to New Zealand in that context, apart from the Maori culture. So I think there's been probably, for some of the Chinese people I know that have been here sort of more towards the 20, 25 year mark, I think initially when they came, they probably were reasonably ostracized. But in the modern context, that is certainly not the case these days.
Mm-hmm. I would like to provide listeners with some context here because Pete was talking about, the number of people in New Zealand and crouching on like the 5 million and not even there yet, I think. But
No.
I mean, 25 years ago, far less than that. And if you're a New Zealander or a Kiwi, as New Zealanders often call themselves, and you're looking, you're gazing towards the giant called China, nearly 1.5 billion people. And for them to send like just 5 million people to come to New Zealand and essentially make it a Chinese colony is no big deal, really. And the Chinese, if they wanted to, And the Chinese do have a history of actually doing that. You know, when they want to Chinesize a region, they would send a lot of Chinese people. They would become a part of the population, and over, you know, a generation or two or three or four, the place would become Chinese for all intents and purposes. So I
Look,
mean,
inherently, that's definitely happening. I think there'd probably be people in our community that do have real concerns about that. I think also, though, you know, globalization is just something that's happening a lot everywhere. And New Zealand has actually built quite close ties with China and Southeast Asia as a whole, particularly in trade. So it's been quite lucrative for New Zealand in many ways. You know, much of the rural agricultural community are very reliant on China in the context of what we sell to them. So there's a reciprocal relationship there for sure. Also, from my perspective, though, a lot of the Chinese people that I've had exposure to have purposely moved here for better environment, better schooling, better access to nature, and certainly come here for a different life as well. So there's definitely been that sort of big rise of Chinese culture into our country, and certainly no doubt, depending on who you talk to, some people were probably quite concerned about that. As someone who's dedicated much of my life to Chinese medicine and integrated a lot of the cultural dynamics of Chinese culture into my own life, you know, it's not something that I have too much of a fear about, personally speaking, but I can totally see where people might be coming from in that context.
mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I was trying to make the point that people shouldn't jump to conclusions about something like racism. It's not necessarily that the people don't like the Chinese because they're Chinese, but rather because they're this very small, relatively small island nation, and they just don't want their own culture to be swallowed up by this giant.
Absolutely. Interestingly, one of the things that New Zealand's doing quite a good job of, I think, in my opinion, you know, I've got two young kids at school, and part of the schooling curriculum, any Chinese family that comes into New Zealand with children and they're putting their children through our school, those children are going to inherently learn the indigenous cultural language and aspects of the New Zealand culture and coming here. So things like speaking Te Reo, which is our indigenous language, taking up crafts like weaving and things like the haka, which you may know through rugby. This is all taught in schools. So, you know, there's a strong ability to integrate different cultures into the Kiwi culture. And I do think in the context that, as I said previously, New Zealand is basically a country that has been colonized by the West, ultimately speaking. There was a time there where Māori culture almost completely was lost, you know, in the context of its language and its identity. And it's over the last sort of particularly 20 years or so, there's been a significant attempt to really bring back better education to children around the indigenous culture. And I think most people that come and move to this country would be well exposed to that. So, you know, there's an integration process there, which I think is really important for any culture, you know, no matter where you go in the world, just to get a feel for the local lingo and how people live. And certainly all the Chinese people that I know would consider themselves to be Kiwis, you know, in that context, particularly the people that have been here for a few generations now.
Yeah, but before we jump back into martial arts, I just want to inform listeners, in your own words, tell people about this business relationship that New Zealand has with China in terms of things like Chinese medicine, say, with the commercial growing of deer antler and such.
Yeah, absolutely. So New Zealand's primarily a big industry is agriculture and also tourism. So tourism's obviously under the pump at the moment, but previously, the Chinese input into our tourist culture would be significant for our country. But really, we're a big agricultural country, so certainly there is a lot of trade heading towards China. And what they really, import from New Zealand is more the sort of high-end meats and dairy products type sort of market. There has been a relationship around the use of growing herbal formulas and things here in New Zealand, for sure. I do know of a few people that run small companies like that, but it's not a significant trade. Interestingly, one of the challenges, I think, I'm not an advanced herbalist by any extent of the imagination. My career has been more in acupuncture, Tuina, and neuroscience, but the reality is trying to actually get these Chinese herbs to grow in a different country and still have the right potency and things is easier said than done. So there are challenges there in that context. Vice versa, obviously we import significantly from China as well. And, I think if you were talking with someone who has been in the trade industry for a long time, they would probably have some glaring concerns about that. And also for some people, they've probably done very, very well out of it. A good example is honey. We produce some of the highest grade Manuka honey in the world. And, places like China just buy it by the bucket load. So New Zealand's done quite well out of that, I think.
Yeah. So, all right. Let me ask you this. Chinese martial arts. You're just talking about how Chinese culture and Chinese people weren't as well assimilated into Kiwi culture back in the day, say 25 years ago. So what brings young Pete in this direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I've probably got a similar story to what a lot of people may do. I had an inherent interest in East Asian culture from a very young age. I probably started taking an interest around the age of sort of 14, 15. A bit of exposure, essentially for two primary reasons for me. One, I had autoimmune condition, which was really affecting my health outcomes right through my childhood. And basically, I'd been right through the sort of Western medical path with that, the utilization of immune suppressants, steroidal treatments, all that sort of carry on, and was essentially quite unwell. So, in looking for an answer there, I started exploring other modalities of healthcare at quite a young age. I think I had my first acupuncture experience when I was about 15 or 16. And it was quite profound. The experience was just mind-blowing for me. And I felt a massive shift in my health status through that experience. And so basically from that point on, I was like, what is going on in Chinese medicine that we're not utilizing here in the West? I need to know more about this. And so that led me into really starting to just, I went and found books in the library, found pressure point charts and all that sort of stuff, and just started sort of digging deeper. And there, of course, started to take interest in Qigong, yoga, meditation. And really, I sort of forayed into that like a lot of people do. At that age, I was practicing about 20 different things. I think I'd tried Aikido, Muay Thai kickboxing, Blintuag, some Filipino stuff. I'd been playing around in the karate scene as well, and I came along to a class once and we did a Qigong session. It was just one of the 5 element systems, and that just really galvanized to me that there was something quite unique and powerful inside that practice that I wanted to really go in and explore.
Well, wait a second. So just two quick questions. First of all, when you first found this 5-element Qigong practice, were you at the time, you were still a teenager, right?
Yeah.
Were you able to already see that this was somehow related to traditional Chinese medicine?
It wasn't and it wasn't initially introduced to us like that. But the story is interesting. I was actually, you might be aware of Zendu Kai, the sort of mixed martial art type community. I was just in one of those classes, and a guy came along and said, "We're going to do Qigong." I'd never heard of it before, and we were, slow moving and breathing. And I felt a really big shift in my physiology through that, just an innate sense as an asthmatic that I was breathing differently. And I can even, because at the time I had incredibly painful eczema, I could even feel my skin had changed just within that sort of 20 minutes of doing that. So the first experience was just quite a personal one. I wasn't overly aware of where the tradition came from or too much about that, but I pretty quickly started exploring that. They were talking about 5 elements, and I was like, well, what's that? Went and found a few books and started reading. This is pre-internet sort of time, so a couple of raggedy books in the town library sort of stuff. And that's when I started to make the connection.
Wait, just a second before sorry for stopping you once more. I had 2 questions. The second thing, which I didn't want to skip, if you're open to talk about, just briefly, what kind of condition you were suffering from, and if you were able to completely get over it using traditional Chinese medicine.
Absolutely. That is exactly the story. So I had a pretty sort of strong autoimmune deficiency. My body is basically overproducing histamine, which is an inflammatory marker that your immune system uses to attack inflammation. And this was creating a really aggressive eczema and asthma. And by aggressive, I mean, head to toe, just covered in sore skin, and really, significant asthmatic conditions. So that comes with the raft of things like chronic fatigue. I was suffering from insomnia, therefore, mood-related challenges, depression, anxiety, those sorts of things as well. And that, I really wanted to find my way out of that. So yes, Chinese medicine was the answer for that. I met my first really talented Chinese medical practitioner a few years after that, actually. Once I'd sort of started exploring it, I moved up to the capital city, Wellington, and I met a guy called Dr. Henry Su, who's a well-known herbalist and acupuncturist in the New Zealand community, and was one of the leading people who really brought Chinese medicine into New Zealand as a whole.
Would you like to mention the names of the doctors who had helped you? So if someone is in New Zealand, he might be able to approach them or their students?
Absolutely. So Dr. Henry Su is in Wellington. He runs a place called the Good Health Clinic. He's still in practice now. And he really became a mentor for me, not only as a physician for helping me with my own health journey, but he also was one of my teachers when I started my education process about a year after I met him. But he was the first person, this is the difference in Chinese medicine. Every time I've been to a Western doctor, they were like, well, here's some steroids, here's an immune suppressant, go home. He was the first person that said to me, this is going to take you 8 years.
Oh my God. 8 years. Okay. I must, again, I got to give some context to listeners. So one of my personal mentors is Professor Stephen Jakovitz from Long Island, who also works in Connecticut. And he always tells me, when you treat someone with herbs, roughly speaking, on average, for every year of a chronic condition, you would treat them for about a month. It's roughly the ratio. So if every month is equal 1 year of suffering, and the doctor just told Pete back in the day, it's going to take 8 years. This is a really serious condition.
Yeah, totally. Look, I was in a pretty bad way. And, looking back on that now, in many ways it was a blessing. It brought me into a culture and into an area in my life journey that would have just not happened, in New Zealand for sure at that young age. But, what he was really pointing out is, when we look at Chinese medicine and we start thinking about the cycles of Jing, 7 and 8-year cycles for sort of hormonal development, birth, growth, death, those sorts of things. He was really pointing out that, you know, you've been born like this. It's going to take one cycle of your life to sort of resolve it. And you need to be disciplined and dedicated to achieving that. Which I
Okay.
did.
So we again, like, I think not all listeners, probably the majority of listeners, are not going to be familiar with the context here. So just very briefly, much of Chinese medicine is based off a book called the Huangdi Neijing. Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Internal Classic. And it's from this book that comes the tradition and the understanding that men and women have these cycles, natural biological cycles in their bodies. Men have cycles of 8 years and women of 7 years. And I was just about to ask Pete, and he essentially answered that. How did that doctor, Henry Su, how did he know it's going to take 8 years? Where did he come with that number from? And it's from the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Internal Classic. It's the idea that the body goes through cycles of 8 years. So in healing the body from a condition that's chronic and so severe, you need a full cycle of 8 years to get to the bottom of it.
Absolutely. And, you know, what I liked about that was the inherent honesty that came with that. There was no sort of peddling a product or trying to sell something to me on the day. He was really pointing out the journey that needed to take place. And then, of course, the conversation can then open up as well. What do we implement over that time? So, you know, I pretty much committed myself to learning Chinese medicine at that point in my life, receiving treatment at least twice a week with acupuncture, and drinking herbs, just drinking bucket loads of herbs for years on end.
What were you
slowly over time?
What were you taking? Patent herbal medicines and pills and such, or were you actually cooking your own herbs every day?
Cooking my own herbs every day. Yeah,
for years.
I never had all my flats at that time in my life were like, "What's that smell?"
Yeah.
Yeah. So look, I prefer the raw herbs. You know, herbalism is not an area that I've gone deeply into. I'm very focused on anatomy. You know, I love the physicality of the martial arts, the qigong. I love needling people and doing tuina. So I'm more of a hands-on sort of practitioner. But herbal medicine is one of the hallmarks of the Chinese medical model, obviously, and particularly for sort of chronic internal medicine like that, I think it's a critical aspect. And it fascinated me at the time as well that my experience of medicine up to that point had been like, well, you've got either immune suppression or steroids. These are your options. And every time I went into his clinic, it'd be a different brew every single time. And he'd always say, well, you've changed. You've changed after that last formula, so you need something different. And I just thought this is incredibly dynamic and very much more in line with what my body's needing. And it was easy to stick to because I was also fascinated in how it was affecting my body. I do remember 1 or 2 times drinking brews and just looking up and my eyesight just being completely different, you know, feeling your kidneys and your back and just thinking, what's in this stuff? So as a young lad, it was exciting to see that change in my own physiology. And it really made me beg the question, why are we not utilizing this medicine? You know, and I think in the context of where this conversation is going to go around martial arts, I think that there's a real need for us to be implementing martial arts culture into our communities and certainly into our clinical models for part of health rehabilitation. I think it's a very useful tool.
All right, we would get to that, but I want to go back into those teenage and young adult years. So you start healing yourself and you get to Chinese martial arts. How?
Well, a few different routes. Initially, the first exposure that I really had to a therapeutic intervention was really meditation, breathwork, and yoga. So coming in from the Ayurvedic angle. But what I found is, particularly at that age, you know, sort of 16, 17-year-old, pretty young, I did find the sort of static forms quite challenging. You know, sitting down doing pranayama made a lot of sense to me. I'm an asthmatic. I'm going to learn how to breathe. But I found it irritating and frustrating. And so I started to look more towards meditation techniques that integrate movement. And so I started to explore Taiji. And I did a bit of a walk around in that world. I learnt Wu style, Qing, and Yang. I ended up sticking with the 108 Yang style form in the end. Just do one thing well. And I loved that. I loved the feeling of being able to meditate, use attentional awareness and have all of those aspects, but also the way that it was affecting my physiological structure through movement as well.
Okay, so a question here. I think with one of your teachers, and we would get to that, you actually had the option. You could study any one of these freestyles in greater depth, but you chose to continue with the 108 form in Yang style. Why this choice, especially as a young man, right? Because a lot of people prefer taking up a Yang style when they're older.
Yeah, well, interestingly, when you've got a chronic autoimmune condition, it's like being a young person in an old body. You know, your joints are inflamed, everything's painful. So I wasn't able to do anything that would cause me to sweat too much. You know, so the sort of faster forms like Shaolin or something like that were not suitable to me. Also at the time, with the level of fatigue that I was dealing with, the gentleness of that style was achievable. It was actually an achievable exercise routine that I could actually do without really aggravating my condition and sort of overheating my system, as it were. So partly the choice was made for me in the context of what I was just capable of and able to do. And as I looked around the different styles, it was also partly because of the teacher that I had who was teaching me the 108 form. He was also the founder of the acupuncture register in New Zealand and the acupuncture school.
Who is that?
Adojala Musa Olatunji. So we call him Tunji for short.
So I think he's a famous teacher who had passed away just recently, right?
Absolutely. He passed away just a couple of years ago. So you know, he was introduced mainly into martial arts as a young man in New York, in the Bronx. And he spent time training at the Jinmanjing School in America, and then spent quite a lot of time in Taiwan as well, training over there. And essentially, I think he came to New Zealand for a holiday to check out New Zealand and basically said, I'm not leaving. So he was a big influence on the whole martial arts community here, because he was an Aikido practitioner, was really a massive influence in Kudo, the Japanese archery, right down to making all his own bows and everything. He was the real deal in that context. So he was really my primary mentor. And, you know, I met him when I was 19, and that's when he basically said to me, he goes, right now, you're doing about 15 different types of practice, and you're doing them all terribly. I think what you need to do is to do one thing well. And so he really got me to focus, you know, quite specifically on just Qigong and Taiji, partly because I think that was going to be the best benefit for my health, but also, as many of the community that we're probably talking to here are aware, best to learn one form properly and just get that right. So he was a huge mentor. I trained with him for nearly 21 years before he passed away. So a huge influence in my life, and I spent a lot of my career teaching at the acupuncture school, so he was also an employer for me throughout my career as well. So he was sort of the person who really popularized the use of acupuncture in New Zealand. He got the accident compensation program which we have here in our country to fund acupuncture. So he had a massive input on bringing the culture and the medicine and the martial arts alive in this country. So we're very grateful for his work.
This is very quite a life's work by this man. And back in the day, I was looking to perhaps immigrate to New Zealand a few years ago.
That's right.
And I have spoken with quite a number of people who only had good things to say about him.
Yeah, absolutely. He was, he was a very gentle giant. He was actually a Nigerian cultural descent, born in America. He's about 6'5" in sort of all directions, so a very big frame. So in the context of the 108 form, he sort of suited that style, I think, in that context, just the sort of larger frame style. And certainly, me being a slighter person, push hands with him was an interesting experience, to say the least. Just sort of like lampshade over your face sort of stuff. It was good fun. I was very, very blessed to have such a close relationship with him over such a long period of time.
Did he teach you a Chen Manqing version of that 108 form?
No, he didn't. He only taught the Yang Chen Fu style, so slightly bigger frame. In that context, later on in my career, I did have a look around a few of the other stylistic preferences. I learned a couple of the sort of more modernized, like the 32 sword form, that sort of thing. But interestingly, as I move into my middle years, I have 2 children, a big medical business that I operate here. So I get around about an hour and a half a day for training. So I like to keep it pretty focused. So I do stick to that form. And the Yin Yang Bapan are the 2 things that I, really focused on throughout my training, just to keep it simple and keep it focused. Yeah.
Mm. So Tanja Sensei was your mentor for 20-something years, and he was also your introduction to Chinese martial arts. How did you continue on the path into the Chinese arts later?
Initially, when I first met him, he sort of pointed out to me that there's a real opportunity here for me to create a career in medicine and the Chinese arts as a whole, which, to be fair, in New Zealand 23 years ago, that just was diabolical. I remember going home to my parents saying, I'm going to study Taoism and become a Chinese medical doctor. And my dad just nearly fainted.
Oh, I mean, that's not what they hear. They hear that you're going to stab people with needles for a living, right?
Yes. So, look, there was a fair bit of resistance to the concept, initially speaking. But, I'd had that personal experience of how much it had improved my own health and well-being. I felt there's inherently, this is a medicine that stood the test of time. And I was just absolutely fascinated by it. I really, truly was. So at that point in New Zealand, we had diplomas available for Tuina, Chinese massage, and acupuncture. So I went through that process at the school, and then pretty quickly at the end of my first 2 years of study in medicine, the school offered me a job to start teaching. And we created a Qigong and Taiji diploma, which the government funded amazingly for quite a few years. And then, of course, that sort of forayed me deeper into the culture, particularly in the context of becoming a tutor. I really wanted to, be a bridge between modern neuroanatomy and neuroscience and traditional Chinese medicine, because language is important there in the sense of how we communicate with medical physicians, but also a custodian for the culture and the practice as well. You know, I think the ritual and things is absolutely key, but understanding how these things work from a modern perspective and how to communicate them to say a referring physician or a patient is very important as well. So luckily for me, you know, as part of being a teacher at the school, that allowed me to teach a lot of the traditional theory, you know, from the Huangdi Neijing as an example, and really gave me a good foundation in some of the deeper traditions of Chinese medicine and martial arts as a whole. So I just basically got paid to spend my time researching and practicing martial arts and teaching medicine. So I was in quite a unique position as a young adult in that regard, which I'm always very humble and grateful for.
That's certainly a blessing. And you know what? I completely understand your situation as it was back in the day. Coming from a relatively small nation myself, my homeland of Israel, and nowadays it has slightly the upwards of 9 million people. But when I grew up, it was maybe 7.5. And when you have a small country and there is a field of study that's just beginning to sprout, you find that bureaucracy is not as big an obstacle as it tends to get a few decades later. Because
Absolutely.
yeah, the story that Pete is telling us now would have been impossible, probably in New Zealand even nowadays, and certainly in a place like North America, whether in Canada or the United States, where any initiative as such would have needed to go through like 50 different committees and go through this very complex bureaucracy, and they would require you have this and you have that and bring in the money. Oh, you don't have $1 million to invest. Well, too bad. Well, it was quite a unique opportunity. He was the right man in the right time.
Absolutely. You know, to be fair, when I went through the education, it was cheap as chips, you know, compared to what people are paying now. And I think that at that stage, a lot of what people are learning in Chinese medicine and even in Qigong and things now, if you're going to, say, a standard Chinese medical school to get a degree, you know, it's nearly 50-50 with biomedical model. And, you know, I obviously see the inherent importance in that in the context of communicating in a modern context. But when I went through, that wasn't an issue. You know, we just learned traditional Chinese medicine. That's all we learned. There was no attempt to integrate that into the medical system. You know, and
Yeah,
I've actually worked, you know, quite significantly to make that happen, but, you know, it was very traditional.
So what Shifu Pete is talking about here is, and Chinese medicine all over the world nowadays is attempting to get more recognition. And oftentimes the way in which this is done is that Chinese medicine tries to pretend as if it's Western medicine. Now, it's very important when you study Chinese medicine that you learn the language and the science of Western medicine. But you're not a Western medical doctor. You can't pretend that you are. That's not what you do in Chinese medicine. But then you see those people, like Pete said, like the 50%, as much as 50% of the curriculum might be taken out of a medical degree. And it's not that it's irrelevant, but it's not exactly traditional Chinese medicine.
Absolutely. I think that there's a real place for understanding what an event like acupuncture or Qigong or an internal martial art practice is from a biomedical perspective. I think that's a fascinating area of research for us, which I'll talk to in more detail maybe later on. And I think that to see Chinese medicine being utilized in the West where it probably could be, you know, it should be integrated into hospitals. It should be utilized across a wide variety of different medical interventions. There is going to be a need to be able to understand the mechanisms of these medical interventions from a biomedical perspective and be able to communicate that. But I think it's also absolutely critical that when you go through your training, that you're absolutely steeped in the tradition. Because at the end of the day, if we look at the reductionist model of Western focus on things like movement therapy or medical interventions, Chinese medicine is based on the concept of a dynamic reciprocal relationship between herbalism, tuina, acupuncture, qigong, how they're integrated as a whole, and a dynamic reciprocal relationship between all of the different organ systems and tissues of the body and our relationship with the environment. And Western medicine is significantly limited in this area. You know, you go and see the urologist for your, for your bladder problems, and you go and see the cardiologist for your heart problems, and nobody makes the connection that those two things are integrated with each other. So Chinese medicine has a lot to offer there. It's just about the language that we use and how we present that. And we do have leaders in the community like Dr. Michael Corradino, Peony Chang is another example, who are doing an amazing job of taking those traditional models, shining a neuroscientific biomedical mindset onto that, and then creating an integrated way of presenting that to the Western medical world. So it's a critical thing that we need to do. I mean, I work in a big medical center with multiple different Western physicians, and I certainly can't talk Jinglo, channel theory or anything like that with them. It's just not going to happen. So we have to be able to communicate clearly, but not at the expense of not recognizing where the tradition comes from and the amazing observations that traditional Chinese medicine and internal martial arts have made about the human organism. I think it's absolutely critical that we understand the tradition well.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot that I would like to get into here, but we don't want to miss on the martial aspect of your vast experience. Yep. So cool. Let's go back. So I know that the main system you primarily practice and teach nowadays is Bhagwajang.
Yep.
And we haven't gotten into how you found your Bhagwa teacher, what kind of Bhagwajang it is, and what Bhagwa is actually, for those who don't know.
Well, my experience of that was an interesting little story unto itself, really. I was teaching at the acupuncture school, and my primary teacher, Tunji, said, I really want to introduce you to Dr. Stephen Young. And what happened there was, the reason why he did that was because part of my role as an educator at the school was to communicate with traditional Chinese medical practitioners and implement systems that they were utilizing into the curriculum. So I met Dr. Yan, and my relationship with him was interesting. So basically the deal was that he would give me private training in tuina and martial arts if I did his paperwork for him as a tutor at the school. So the relationship started like that. And what happened was, on the very first time we started training, he just showed me this weird posture. I mean, he was just like, I want you to be able to hold that for 10 minutes. And, I'd never seen anything like it. Knees squeezed together, palms forward. It was all very low, squatting, very dense sort of position. And over about, I think, maybe it was about 6 months to a year, maybe to 8 months, every month he'd give me a different posture. And he really didn't say much about them. He just said, look, I really want you to be able to utilize these. And I sort of thought, wow, this is a little bit like Chinese yoga or something. I don't even know what this is. After about 8 months, I'd been given 8 postures that I had to hold statically. And at the end of that point, he was like, I'm amazed that you've put up with this. I've never had a student actually want to do this. You're just like coming in and staring at the wall and holding these postures. I'm really impressed by that. And so at that point, he said this is a system called Yin Yang Bhagwajang, so the static postures. And he then sort of said it actually comes from an entire system. And if you are keen, I'll continue to teach you more. And I was like, okay, this sounds cool. And at that point, we started to get into moving between those postures gently and starting the stepping techniques, which there were 5 of. One of those stepping techniques is the circle walking, which is sort of what is being popularized as Bhagwa throughout the world. And there are now, a plethora of variations and different systems of that. But interestingly, in the context of Yin Yang Bapan, it's actually one of 5 different stepping techniques. And, to be fair, at the time that there wasn't internet around, I didn't have really much understanding about the history or lineage or anything like that. It was just basically Dr. Jan and myself practicing the system. And from my perspective, I was like, oh, this is probably just another internal martial art. I had no understanding about the fact that it was A, quite rare, B, parts of that have been pulled out and turned into the popular form of Bhagwa. And it wasn't until quite a lot later into my journey of learning that I, around about the time where we sort of started getting Google and I was able to sort of research online, that I was like, I can't find this anywhere. I can't find a video of this anywhere. What is this?
Okay, so two things. Nowadays, if you look for Yin Yang Bapanjang, you could find it online. Nowadays, there is information. I bet on Pete's website as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we would have the links in the video description. Also, how old were you when you started practicing that system?
I was 22 when I met Dr. Jan, and the first, around about sort of 6 to 8 months, nearly almost a year, was only static postures. And really, he basically kept up that static form of practice for nearly 3 years. So really the main part for the first 3 years was just the static postures and learning how to hold those postures and blend them from one to the other like a slow-moving Qigong system.
So essentially you had the two, in my opinion, most important components in a traditional teacher-student relationship that you could have, especially in Oriental traditions. And that could be a painting tradition, a medical tradition, a martial tradition, which is, number one, he became the personal assistant to the teacher.
Totally.
Which is just the best way to learn anything in life. I mean, it even works in commercial companies. If you become personal assistant to the CEO, oftentimes people like that would become CEOs one day themselves.
Absolutely.
So that's one. The second one is that he was being tested for a very long time, for 8 months initially to see if he's up to even learning the system. And overall for 3 years, because for 3 years he mostly did those static postures. So I'm not sure why Dr. Jan had chosen you specifically to be tested like that, but apparently he liked you, right?
Yeah, I mean, initially he was pretty mean to me, to be fair, and I probably needed that. I think, the discipline was great. And the relationship is exactly what you were saying. I'll give you an appreciation for how it worked. So twice a week I'd go up to his clinic. I would pay him $40 each time. I would do his paperwork for him, clean his fish tank, give him Twainer for about an hour and a half or so, which just even toning your hands up on his body was, he was a bit of an old iron shirt practitioner from back in the day. And then he'd make me stand and face the wall and do the postures for about an hour and a half every time that I was there. And this went on for about 3 years. And it wasn't until about the 3rd year that he actually sort of said, look, I think it's time for us to start really teaching you the second part. And that's when we really started getting into the things like the different stepping techniques, linking them together and creating forms with them. And then finally, you know, we went through and did all the 9 palace stepping techniques. I learned broadsword, double-headed spear, and sun and moon hooks as well.
Okay, let's put some order into this. So first of all,
yep.
those standing methods are a type of Zhangzhuang. And
yep.
You and I know that it's not just about standing. There's a lot of internal work going inside of you while you do it. But to
Absolutely.
actually make it happen, you don't just stand there. You have very specific instructions about what you should be imagining, how you move the chi around in the body, etc., etc. Was he talking about such things from the beginning, or only after 8 months or 3 years?
So initially, but because I was also studying Tuina with him, and I was then taking what he was teaching me and teaching that to students, there was a lot of dialogue around, you know, the channel system, meridian pathways. Certainly we had a lot of dialogue about cultivating of the dantian and breathing technique. But, you know, I've actually found a lot of the Chinese practitioners to be quite shy around the conversations of internal practice in the early years of your training. You know, a lot of it was just, you know, do what I tell you to do, get it done. And then as time went by, those conversations certainly opened up more as our relationship grew as well, because really I was probably quite young and reasonably annoying. I would have been asking a lot of probably what now I think about as pretty dumb questions. So a lot of the time it was just like face the wall and get the work done, please. But in that context, there was a significant focus on breath regulation, attentional awareness, you know, where to focus, you know, what to put your attention on. And in those first couple of years, postural integration. That was the real thing that sung true to me, was actually just toning the ligaments and tendons and joints and getting them into a position so that you're actually even capable to move in those postures without causing yourself injury. You know, so a lot of that preparatory work was very, very structurally orientated, and there was a lot of guidance in that regard.
Okay, so another thing you mentioned in passing was the circle walking system that's very well known and associated with the martial art of Bhagwajang. And Yin Yang Bhagwajang is a system that some claim predates the Bhagwajang that most people practice, meaning that it was extant before Dong Haichuan, the famous Bhagwajang practitioner, started teaching in Beijing. Now, what you mentioned in passing was that circle walking in Yin Yang Bhagwajang was only 1 out of 5 main stepping methods. Could you kindly elaborate on what the other 4 are?
Yeah, so obviously the circle walking has been the most popularized one. Interestingly, the other steps seem to have some similarity with sort of Shingi 6 harmony stepping. So straight line stepping. So what they called fish scales, you know, squatting low and just shuffling your feet forward. There was diagonal stepping techniques where you'd be working from one corner to another if you're sort of imagining yourself working around a box. The other thing that was quite different is that rather than doing the stepping, particularly in the circle walking, with your feet in a straight line, you're actually stepping with your feet parallel, which is a slightly different aspect as well. There's kicking techniques at various heights up towards the chest, which were taught as part of that. And what was the other one that I was going to speak to? Inch stepping, you know, so springing forward and back. So we would often just be doing like a 1, 2, 3 type steps. So similar to sort of 6 harmony, Shingi style of practice. Yep.
Mm-hmm. All right. And could you sort of briefly elaborate on the structure of the curriculum?
Yep, absolutely. So the way that it worked for me was, as I said, the first block was just learning the 8 postures. And that was continued in the first 3 years. During that time, we learned quite a lot of Qigong systems as well as part of that training. And then from the postures, we went into linking postures. So just holding the feet, the knees together and squatting, and just linking the 8 postures with the upper body. So you were basically training the upper and lower body separately. Once we got the upper body moving, then we went into the stepping techniques. After we had done the stepping techniques and the upper body training palms, what they call the 8 palms, then we started to learn how to link those together, and we started creating sequences to produce a form. And in that context, that was, I really started not really getting into that phase until about year 5. I think it was, off the top of my head. And then between year 5 and year 12, which is when I sort of wrapped up with that particular training process, what we did is we basically created forms of movement and integrated that into things like the 9 palace stepping techniques, so walking around poles, and learning application. So the latter part was really more about applying those techniques, in the context of a martial art form. And the final stage, when we got up into sort of year 8 through to year 12, we started adding weapons in and doing 2-person techniques. So doing the circle walking techniques, linking hands. And so you're sort of working around the circle in opposite polarities with the person, and doing them as pairs. So it went much more into sort of a little bit like push hands type techniques, but within a Bhagwa type movement platform. Mm-hmm. So it was a 12-year program all up, and I didn't stop at the 12-year mark in the context of my personal training. I just moved into a different stage of my career, and wasn't really able to commit that amount of time to studying with Dr. Yan in the context of my clinical work. So my attention started to shift a little bit at that point.
Was there more to the curriculum which you did not have the opportunity to study?
Look, no doubt. Dr. Yan used to always say to me, minimum 7 years under your teacher's eyes to get a good foundation, upwards towards 13 years to learn the whole system. And I know, in the context of my personal training, I certainly could have spent more time on weapons and those sorts of things with them if I really wanted to continue to elaborate. I don't doubt that for a minute. And I'm sure that when my kids are a little bit older and I take them back down the road and start their training with him, he'll probably slap me on the wrist and have me in the corner doing stances again, because it's just how it always works.
Oh, well, someone, gets married, they have children, priorities change. It's just natural.
Yeah, totally. So what I do is, I keep up the foundational training. I use the basic stances every day. I continue with the stepping techniques and the basic sort of formats, and just go through the sequence as I learnt it, and I keep the foundational practices up and running. I have less time for heading outside and playing with weapons and things like that. But my choice was really, as I said earlier on in the conversation, do a couple of things well, and really focus on those aspects. And so my morning training routine, I incorporate Qigong, Yin Yang, Bhagwajang, and Taiji routines. And that's sort of my set that I use for my own health and well-being on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. All right. So for those who are not that familiar with those internal Chinese martial arts, Bhagwajang is a martial art that borrows from the theories of the I Ching. I Ching being the book of changes, and in the I Ching there is a system, an 8-factor based system, or you could actually say it's a system based on the powers of 2, that starts with Yin Yang, the symbol of Taiji, that elaborates into the 4 ideas, 4 principles, 4 frameworks called 思想, and that grows into what we call the Bagua, the eight, we translate into English as the 8 trigrams. In Chinese, just 8 gua. Gua is this type of symbol that they have. And the Bagua, the 8 trigrams, evolves in turn into the 64 hexagrams, which 8 times 8 is 64. Now, in all systems of Bhagwajang, there is a correspondence between these trigrams and hexagrams and related theories from the Book of Changes, the I Ching, and the actual physical practice. And the Book of Changes, the I Ching, is also related to Chinese medicine. It's related to Taoism, to Confucianism. Basically, all of Chinese culture is steeped in the theories that arise from this ancient book. Now, what I wanted to ask Shifu Pete here is, in other systems of Bhagwajang, they tend to associate the 8 basic postures, or the 8 basic palm changes, as they're called, the basic movement combinations. These 8 basic movements or postures with the 8 trigrams, and then also have parallels at times of 64 practices, 64 combinations, or 64 short forms with the 64 hexagrams. Is that also a thing in Yin Yang Bapanjang as you were taught it?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly that was that level of theoretical orientation to the I Ching was not something that was in the conversation topic commonly. It wasn't really until maybe about my 5th year in that system that I actually just brought that up. You know, in the training, I was just like, hey, look, you know, we've got these 8 postures, we've got these 5 steps. You know, if we start linking these all up, I can sort of start to see that there's probably, you know, 64 changes here. Is this correlated, you know, to the I Ching? And what my teacher basically said, and it was quite an interesting viewpoint, because there's 2 quite different schools of thought here. One school of thought is that there is an inherent theoretical attempt to try and embed the martial art practices into the I Ching, and the other way being that the martial art practice was based on the I Ching in the first place. And so in the context of what he sort of said, he was like, the reality is there are similarities, but certainly it wasn't sort of spoken about as being the foundational root behind the postures or the way that we're connecting them. He was of the opinion that there's an attempt to sort of integrate everything into those theoretical models. So I think he probably had a slightly modernistic view around that, you know, and maybe quite heavily influenced by some of the exposure to Western culture there, potentially speaking. And it wasn't something that we made a big focus on in the context of the training. Partly, I think that was also because realistically, the study of the I Ching it's a PhD unto itself. I mean, you know, if you're going to really go down that path and understand its influence on Chinese culture, you could just spend your whole life studying that. So I think he was of the opinion of like, yep, there's a link there, but you're too young and too stupid to understand it. So just focus on doing the form. So I sort of got told not to worry about it too much. But, you know, I think it's an interesting topic, because even if we look at the 5 element systems and the concordances, you know, the attempt to sort of categorize nature into these different groupings like the 8 and the 5 and the 3, there was obviously a huge impact on Chinese culture in the context of how it was organizing its thinking there. And I think that there are scholars, you know, who have dedicated really their entire life to that subject. My leniency in that context was more about the physical practices and the doing part of the martial arts, less the theoretical component. And also in that context, a lot of the training that I was doing with Dr. Yan at the time was also around needling technique and Chinese medical components. And so we had a lot of theory that we were doing already in that context. So he was quite focused. I think really he wanted me to hone my skills in tuina, in Chinese massage and bone setting, acupuncture, and to do the forms well, and to represent the forms in that context. There were times where he certainly sat down and listed off the lineages and all of that stuff. And, as Chinese as a second language, I just found a lot of that quite overwhelming, really. So, I was fascinated when I first met you online, because you contacted me and said, we've probably got some lineage that we're sharing here. And I was just like, oh, really? That's fascinating. So, I was very grateful when I received your book and read through that, because it actually helped to galvanize some of the links between how did my teachers inherently receive this information and get passed down to me. So I was very grateful for your work in that area. Certainly, I'm by no means a historian, and certainly I'm a big advocate of mentorship. So if I can jump on the platform like someone like yourself who's done a lot of work in that area and dedicated to that, I'm always very grateful for receiving that knowledge, and certainly in the context of passing down what I've inherited. A lot of the work that I've had to be focused on is really about implementing this culture and medical and martial knowledge into a setting where we can utilize this in our clinical environments within our country. So I've had a very strong focus on that area in the context of my own personal development.
So first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Pete, for your kind words. I mean, I'm flattered relative to Pete. I'm not that great of a scholar. He's much deeper into Chinese things than I am. But I may have just written more about it.
I'm certainly not the writing type. Look, and ultimately, I think as practitioners of internal martial arts who are from a different culture, we're inherently going to get different things from that, and we're going to inherently focus on different components of the practices. You just can't do it all. It's impossible. It's just such a deep subject. So I think it's important that we all recognise that we're adding to the culture and its importation into the West in different ways and forms, and everyone has something to bring in that regard. And certainly in the context of my observations of studying neuroscience and looking at, what is an internal martial art from a neuroscience perspective?
Oh, okay. So this is...
you could spend your whole life just on that one piece.
Well, we are going to get deep into this thing you just were beginning to discuss here. But first of all, I just want to give a little bit of context. I first contacted Pete a few years ago. I had sent him my book, Research of Martial Arts. That's the book he was talking about. And yes, I had already forgotten myself that we are somehow connected through that lineage of Yin Yang Bhagwajang. I actually do not practice that martial art myself. However, there is an ancestor in my own lineage, Grandmaster Lu Zhongren, who had passed away since, and he was a practitioner of both Yin Yang Bhagwajang and of Xin Yi Chuan. Now, I had inherited some of the knowledge that comes down from his Xin Yi Chuan, and Pete is affiliated with knowledge that comes down from his Yin Yang Bhagwajang. So in that manner, somehow we're in distant family members in that very large martial arts family. But even though we are remote by several generations, we're like maybe fifth or sixth grand cousins or something.
Yeah.
Still, despite this, it turns out that because of our ancestral association in those lineages, we do tend to speak the same language. So when Pete had gotten my book, Research of Martial Arts, it just made sense because we come from very similar mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, we're brothers in arms there, my man.
Yeah. All right. So we wanted to tackle martial arts in a therapeutic environment, and we're gonna get to that. But first off, Pete just came up with something that I think would make for a brilliant discussion, which is internal martial arts and neuroscience. Like,
Yeah.
where'd you get this? Okay, give us some
Well,
answers.
yeah, so part of my research and work that I've been involved in requires cadaver research, so dissection work. And something that I've learnt by doing dissection and being involved in cadaver research is that, you know, what were our forefathers looking at when they were looking at the anatomy of the body? You know, when they came up with things like the Jinglo network, the channels, the collaterals, obviously the type of movements that they were doing were very guided by those structural observations. And so, you know, one of the things that we do in our cadaver research is we go and look at a pressure point, you know, what we now call a functional neuroanatomical unit. We dissect it and have a look at what it is, right?
The Chinese just call it, you know, shui, cavity. And in Western terms must be this fancy scientific term.
Yeah. So the thing that struck me there, though, is that we're looking at the same body. You know, the human condition actually hasn't changed really for thousands of years. And when we look at the traditional Chinese understanding of anatomy, and we look at the modern biomedical understanding, they're inherently the same thing. It's just you know, the culture and the time that they were looking at it, they came up with a slightly different way of observing it.
You know what it's like? It's like in the book, The Little Prince. It depends on one's cultural point of view, because when they look at a cadaver, even these days, people don't see the same things. It's like the human body is like a work of art. How are you going to describe it? It's not that the science is different, the language is different.
Totally. You know, essentially they dissected the body under the impetus of the heaven, man, and earth, the theory, and that we were an energetic oscillation between heaven and earth. So they really looked at the body from a longitudinal point of view. You know, all the pressure points along the front of the body, they're all nerves. We can dissect them. We know what they are. It's just that they had a way of doing it that was orientated via their culture.
Also,
so
I would like
one of the
to,
things that
just to give a perspective here, from my understanding, when the Chinese were looking at cadavers back in the day, they tried to construct a language around that anatomy that reflects the roots of the body as it developed as a fetus.
Absolutely.
Yeah, rather than, if we look at Western anatomy, it looks at the body as it is when the human is an adult, but without a language that takes into consideration, just in the language, the background of what these structures were intended for, also when were developing in the womb.
Absolutely. There would have been many different influences on how that they observed anatomy. I mean, a good example is that we know that they were inserting long, thin pieces of bamboo into arteries and weaving them along the arteries to see where they terminated in the heart. So, you know, they had a very...
Sorry, could you repeat that? They were taking these thin, long pieces of bamboo, inserting them into the arteries of cadavers, right?
Yep.
And what were they trying to do?
They're trying to find where they terminate. You know, where do they come from? So, you know, obviously all the blood vessels come back to the heart and the lungs. So, you know, when you look at something like that, you start to sort of think, well, wait a minute, we're all looking at the same thing. And so what really interested me, I was like, what are the things inside internal martial arts that make us healthy? Why is it good for our health? You know, obviously we love the culture, we love the activity, it's a great thing for us to do, but it's well known that martial artists have better bone density. It's well known that we have stronger ligaments, more flexibility, better mental cognition. How does all that take place from a modern biomedical perspective? And that's really where my research has gone over the years, is looking at what those mechanisms are. And what I've done is I've brought it down to four main methods that regulate the nervous system, if we're going to talk at it specifically in the context of neuroscience. And I broke it down into four parts, which are posture. So there's a huge piece in postural integration in all internal martial arts and Qigong. Breath. Breath work has significant impacts on our health and well-being, and they're very observable from a neuroscientific perspective. Mind training. There's so much things like attentional awareness, focusing on a specific area of the body, or a specific type of attitude that you're trying to hold inside a practice or a ritual, which I can talk to more in a second. And movement. So if we look at posture, breath, mind control, and movement as the four sort of things that impact the physiological structures of the body, then we can research those individual parts and understand how that might work. And so I've done a significant amount of research in this area to be able to communicate this to physicians, because something like Qigong, as an example, is an amazing tool for concussion rehabilitation. The way that you move your eyes, as an example, is going to exercise muscles in your eyes. Those muscles have nerves. Those nerves terminate in regions of the brain. And when you move your eyes in that way, you're going to improve blood supply to those regions and areas of the brain. So that is significant for stroke rehabilitation, Parkinson's, concussion, as an example. So if we want to be able to utilize internal martial arts like Tai Chi or like Qigong or Bhagwajang, something along those lines, we need to understand what the mechanism is outside of the cultural identity of it, and be able to maybe even enhance it, to be able to utilize it in those environments. So I give exercises to a lot of my clients, and they could be something like Dantian breathing techniques, but I'm going to tell them that this is respiratory vagus nerve stimulation. Because there's a lot of things that we're doing with Dantian breathing that impact the autonomic nervous system, and therefore particular types of neurotransmitters and hormonal modulations in the brain.
Oh, speaking of, by the way, speaking of vagus nerve, I hear from my mentor, Stephen Jagovitz. He was telling me recently how frustrated he is that there isn't enough of a financial investment in Western science and research to look into stimulation of the vagus nerve, because there is scientific studies showing that you could possibly cure diabetes in that manner.
Totally. I mean, we put electrical currents into the vagus nerve every day at our clinic. It's a big part of our work. And look, essentially, I'll give you a little example, I think, to highlight what this might be like, and something that your listeners can do at home. Before you start your breathwork practice, like Dantian breathing or microcosmic orbit or something like that, just take your pulse. Feel the quality of the pulse. Before you start, do a 20-minute practice and take your pulse at the end. And what you're gonna find.
You're forgetting that most people don't even know how to take their pulse.
Yeah, well, just have a wee listen. But what you find is that there's observable changes.
Oh, wait! I have to be clear here. I mean, most people think that taking the pulse is something you do with the stethoscope, or you put your fingers at the side of your neck. Dr. Pete is here referring to traditional pulse-taking methods in Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, where you put three of your fingers on very specific positions at the side of your forearm. So you need to first know how to take that pulse. I'm just saying.
Yeah. So one of the really simple things that you can observe, though, is that after doing breath work or training, your pulse will feel wider and stronger. That's a significant change in your neurological status. You've got more oxygen in your bloodstream, the pulse is wider, it's more relaxed, so your autonomic nervous system's gone into a relaxed parasympathetic state, like rest and digest versus flight and fight mechanism. And if we're talking about a disease like PTSD, you know, a post-traumatic stress disorder.
Wait, I remember PTSD. We're going to get to that in a second. I just want to try and, again, give context to listeners. We're talking about traditional pulse taking in traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine from India. So you'd put 3 of your fingers on and a big artery at the side of your forearm, and you'd have to check both forearms. On each forearm, there are 3 different positions, and each of these correlates with different internal organ. And the idea is when you put your fingers in a certain way on this big artery, you can feel the blood moving in the artery, and the feeling would be different between every person and within every person in different contexts. If you are excited, if you're sick with an acute condition, a chronic condition, every type of thing that your body and mind go through reflects in the pulse. And when you put your fingers like that on the artery, you literally feel the artery like a pipe, and there is a quality of a fluid going through that pipe. And the Chinese can articulate these types of feelings into what are called the 28 basic pulse qualities. So in traditional Chinese medicine, you're taught to put the tips of your fingers on those arteries at different positions. And you know, based on the quality of the pulse, there are at least 28. Advanced students can at times learn even more. Know, okay, what is the internal state of a certain organ, the strength of it, the lack of strength. Maybe the energy is stuck. Maybe something's not moving. Maybe there is a deficiency of energy. Maybe there is a deficiency of blood even. All of these things and many more can be felt in the pulse. And what Pete was just trying to say is that after practice, you put your fingers on that big tube on your forearm, and you'd essentially feel that the fluid going through it makes the tube wider, and the pulsation through the tube is stronger. So for those who are not, trained in taking pulses, that's what he means. Now, going back to you, sorry for stopping you there you were talking about PTSD.
Yeah, so that's a really good overview of the pulse. And the reason why I use that example is that it's important to recognize that the things that we might learn inside a martial art or inside a Qigong practice, they're having powerful neurological events inside our nervous system. And an example would be, say, in traditional Chinese medicine, if someone has an anxiety type presentation, there's going to be a pulse quality that comes with that. So it might be tight and rapid. We use a breathing technique or a movement technique in our practice. And when that pulse changes, that shows us that the physiological status of the nervous system has been adjusted. And so what I've done with my practice and my work in clinic is had a really deep look at what are those events and what are they doing inside our nervous system. So an example would be, I mentioned that inside my observations here, that posture, breath work, mind quality training and movement are the sort of researchable hallmarks. If we look at something like attentional awareness, which is really common across all martial arts, focusing on a specific area of your body. So maybe we're focusing on the lower dantian and utilizing that area to meditate or to guide our movement. What we know is that attentional and awareness significantly improves the function of the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that's associated with cognition, memory, learning, arousal, and wakefulness, as an example. So my sort of interest really lies in when we practice our traditional martial arts, what is it doing to the nervous system? How is it impacting the nervous system?
So,
And
so
certainly,
first, before you get to that, you use the pulse as a benchmark to check that indeed the practice is affecting the practitioner or the patient. And then once you
absolutely.
know based on the pulse as a benchmark, because the pulse has changed, so something has happened, okay, then you look at what actually happened.
Absolutely. And to be fair, there's I'll probably spend the rest of my life studying this. It's a huge piece of work that we're sort of a can of worms that we're opening up here. But the impetus is really primarily because what I've found is inside the internal martial arts community is you're sort of preaching to the choir. You've got people that are already interested and engaged in practice, which is great. But in my clinic, there's no people don't even know what that internal martial arts is, and what they're looking for is health outcomes. And I think something like internal martial arts could have significant impact in, say, something like depression. Depression is almost the
So
number
you're
one illness in the world. And the things like environment, habits, behaviors, the cultures and the cultural rituals and practices that we put into our training, all of these things impact a condition like depression quite significantly. And so we need to understand how it's doing that. And then what are the aspects that are teachable and importable into a clinical setting that are easy to learn and achievable? Because the reality is if you give people too much, they won't do anything. If you don't give them enough, they won't be engaged. So we do have to simplify things a little bit to be able to bring it into that type of environment, which I've done right throughout my entire career. It's very common coming into my clinic that you'll be getting neuropuncture and electrical stimulation, but you'll be getting breath work, mind quality training techniques, postural integration, and it all comes straight out of the internal martial arts, in our Qigong practices.
I think you're hinting at a specific reality here,
Mm.
trying to say that, and correct me if I'm wrong, students are not patients and patients are not students. So when we prescribe these types of practices to patients, we have to use a different approach and different language.
Absolutely. Yep. If we went back to my example about the use of the eyes and the way that we can, think about a martial art form. What are you doing with your eyes when you're practicing? Where are they positioned? Are they following your hands? Are they moving up and down, left and right? Are they quickly moving forward and back? All of those different movements are all innervated by nerves. All of those nerves are innervated by regions of the brain. And I've found in my work with post-concussion, which we see a lot of in the martial arts world, right, that we can actually utilize very specific movements to retrain the eyes, what we call visual orientation rehabilitation. So I think that our internal martial arts systems and Qigong practices, when understood in that context, can then be actually used as a prescription. You can give someone a prescription for a specific type of breath work or a specific type of movement or a specific type of attentional awareness that will influence their nervous system and bring it back into health. And I think that in the context of working in a place like I do, where you're dealing with a lot of different medical physicians from different communities, it's just about recognizing that you do need to be able to communicate that in a language that everybody understands. And ultimately speaking, the results speak to themselves. I mean, how many people come into your martial arts community looking to improve something in their health outcome? Maybe they have a self-confidence issue and social anxiety. So they're taking up martial arts to become more confident and to be more robust in themselves. We're improving people's health and well-being through these practices, absolutely. And understanding how we're doing that is something that's of great interest to me. And I do believe that that's partly ritual, partly culture, partly community, partly being involved in a process and an ongoing training, as an example. And then there are very specific events that are taking place from an anatomical perspective as well. Like I mentioned earlier on, all of us guys that do this, we have more bone density. That's great when you get old. you know, you avoid getting arthritis. You're going to keep your mobility and your joints up. There's a lot of great health benefits, and I think that we can improve our understanding about that by shining a neuroscientific mindset and having a look at what's going on in there. It doesn't mean detract from the culture, the ritual, and the practice, not at all. It's just about understanding what the mechanisms are. And then maybe, you know, if we understand those well, then we can also research them better. You know, I find my example of attentional awareness influencing the thickness of certain regions of the brain is a fascinating example.
Let's focus on specific concrete examples.
Yep.
I have not had much experience myself dealing with people's medical problems. I am a teacher of the martial arts and a real amateur scholar of traditional Chinese medicine. I do plan on studying it professionally, but I have not embarked on that journey yet. And as a martial arts teacher, I've had but a few opportunities to tackle really serious health conditions. One example was I was met with an elderly man. I think he was 70 years old when we met. He had the beginnings of Parkinson's. He was just diagnosed. According to Western medicine, it was just starting to show symptomology. My observation almost immediately within maybe 2 or 3 classes working with this man, specifically working on a type of Qigong that I had studied, health-oriented Qigong that comes from my Southern Mantis system, is that Parkinson's is a type of illness that sort of calcifies the body and the mind. So people gradually become almost like stone. It's you can liken it to Greek mythology of people seeing the face of Medusa and becoming a stone statue. And it is a very, very slow process. So it's really, I think, goes unnoticed by folks who do not come from a physical culture background, say family members, friends. But as a martial arts teacher, you could really see how the person is in the process of literally turning into stone until it kills him or her. And I noticed that person had tremendous benefit from practicing Qigong. And he was at the point, even though it's just the beginning of the illness, he was not walking right. His body was moving almost as if it was a machine that hasn't been oiled in like 20 years. And in 3 months of daily training, he was very dedicated. He was walking. He even started dancing. He took dancing for Parkinson's patients, which I think was very, very useful, by the way. And I do wonder if Parkinson's is unfortunately very common nowadays. You must have had Parkinson's patients. Would you like to?
I think it's a perfect example, actually, for us to look at solid examples of where our internal martial arts and Qigong practices can be impactful. Because essentially Parkinson's is a movement disorder. So what happens is the brain basically gets strangled by what's basically plaque. They're called tau proteins, and they build up in the brain. And what goes on is that there's a little area in the brain called the basal ganglia, and it's in the midbrain. And this part of the brain produces dopamine. And what dopamine does is it allows smooth movement of the joints, right? Mm-hmm. And when this dopamine becomes deficient, the circulation of it from the basal ganglia to the motor cortex is not firing, you essentially get rigidity and stuttering. So their gait becomes limited, their joints become stiff. We see tremor, lack of facial expression, and it's pernicious. So it slowly but surely degenerates the nervous system centrally at the brain. So if we think about something like Tai Chi or say a Qigong practice, what we're going to see there is that we're going to be able to impact their confidence in something like balance. So falls prevention is critical for these people. If they have a fall, you know, then they've got an injury and there's more problems. So the training in Tai Chi is an example where we're standing on one foot to another. Not only does that improve balance, but it stimulates the basal ganglia and motor cortex. So you're actually exercising those regions of the brain that are struggling in that type of condition. Another example would be that people with Parkinson's tend to suffer from anxiety because of the changes in their nervous system and depression. So Qigong can significantly impact that by the use of breath work and building up more oxygen in your bloodstream. And one of the really interesting things that impacts the buildup of plaque in the brain in degenerative diseases is more oxygen. If you can build cerebral blood pressure, get more circulation in the brain, and bring more oxygen to the brain, oxygen is basically anti-rust. You're going to break down this accumulation of these plaques by doing that. So I'm convinced that we can actually slow the progression of these diseases and improve the quality of life outcomes for these patients. And I've had the joy of being able to do this with many different people with Parkinson's over my career. And it is important to recognize that a lot more research is required here. And certainly we are using other modalities like bioelectric stimulation to the brain. But what we find is that if people can take up practices that improve things like balance, spatial awareness, mood and cognition, lift oxygen levels, improve circulation, keep the joints mobile, you're actually slowing the progression of that disease and giving them a significant improvement in their quality of life. So it's impactful in many different ways. And ultimately, if we actually look at it from that perspective of it's a movement-based disorder, so let's use movement to stimulate it, like dance for Parkinson's as an example, we can have a really big impact on these people's quality of life. And as I said, I've had the joy of working with multiple Parkinson's patients throughout my career. And a big part of what we do is we teach them some basic Qigong. Just get them moving, working on their balance, and certainly in the context of Tai Chi, even just learning a few basic steps is enough to really help them with their balance. So I think that that's a great example of where we can see a significant impact. I think in the context, if we're looking for examples here, we have very high rates of depression and anxiety in the world at the moment. Obviously, the sort of COVID environment has really impacted this. And mechanisms like respiratory vagus nerve stimulation through synchronizing the heart and the lungs through breath, which we see a lot in our Qigong practices and in our martial forms, absolutely influences the autonomic nervous system and brings it into homeostasis. So that means stress hormones like cortisol are going to drop, and relaxation neurotransmitters like dopamine and acetylcholine are going to lift up. And
I just want to make a comment here, really.
Yeah, sure.
This thing is so simple if we just use common sense. Common sense is really the best medicine. Look at what... I really want to frame what Pete was saying in a commonsensical way. Look how simple it is. You got an illness like Parkinson's. People lose the ability to move freely and smoothly and with agility. So you give them a practice that allows them to move freely and smoothly and with agility. You've got, yeah, exactly. You got a problem with anxiety. What is anxiety? Anxiety is the feeling that you are losing control. So you give someone a practice that allows them to regain control of themselves, quite literally, physically, you help the anxiety. And I have just an amazing example from a week ago of a student of mine, 16-year-old from Israel. So he reaches out and he says, Shifu, you know, I have this problem. I have pains on my tongue. I have pains in my throat. I have canker sores. It's been 2 weeks, starts interfering with drinking, swallowing. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I know a little about Chinese medicine and common sense. So I speak with a colleague of mine, Shifu Strider Clark, whom we hopefully have on the podcast sometime. He's a great guy. And I asked for a picture of my student's tongue from several angles in daylight. It's very important to take those tongue pictures in natural light. So I send them to Shifu Strider and I say, you know, what do you think? He says, well, my initial line of thought is maybe that's an invasive pathogen because the tongue was covered by this, it had this thick white covering. Not exactly like COVID-19, but also not that good. And the guy's just 16. But they said, no, you know, he has had it for 2 weeks and there are actually no other symptoms. It's just a throat ache, tongue ache, canker sores, can't swallow and drink right. So he says, well, you know what? If it's not a pathogen, just look into the guy's diet. And I say, yeah, let's look into his diet. So I asked the guy, what are you eating? I want you to make me just a list of everything you're eating. Well, lo and behold, the guy eats every single damn food imaginable. There's butter. There is almond butter. There is peanut butter. There is like bananas. What else? Like name me some damn stuff, Pete.
Look, temp foods, you know, yogurt, beer, you know, all of your carbohydrates, yogurt, sugar.
Yeah, yogurt, beer, muesli, sugary things, you name it. Everything that's like on the most damn foods list and drinks, he's eating it, he's consuming it. And I'm like, okay, there's like literally 30 damn things in there. And what are the doctors saying? It's like, oh, you have candida on your tongue, which I don't think he has, but it kind of looks like it because of this white, thick tongue covering. So I'm saying, okay, say it's candida, I don't know. It's a fungus. And you're eating like 30 different damn things. Let's just take out the dampness because fungus eats dampness. We know that. We know, we just know that. So he takes out all the damn things from his diet. I told him the only damn thing you can leave is eggs because you can't just take all of the dampness out of your diet, and eggs are generally speaking healthy. Just eat other things, you know, eat beans, eat rice, you can eat pasta, just do away with the sugar things, all sorts of cheeses. He was eating like 10 different types of cheeses. So takes these things out of his diet. And now, of course, he's relatively healthy, he's 16. Health issues go away in 3 days. 3 days, and the doctors were clueless. Medical doctors, you know, 7 years of training. Who knows how long they've been in the practice? Like, oh, it's this fungus. You take this fungal cream, steroid cream, and this and that, and it's not helping. Just ask the person, like, oh, what are you eating? Is it damp? He's got a fungus. Don't feed dampness to the fungus. Like, common sense, people. Come on, common sense.
I've got another one as well. It's really funny. I had a lady come into my clinic recently with a tremor, and she was like, oh, I think I've got Parkinson's. I'm really stressed and anxious. I've got this tremor. I'm menopausal. I'm super worried. And it's just seen all these neurologists, and everyone's like, oh, we can't seem to figure out what's wrong. And I was like, oh, well, what's your fluid intake like? And she's like, oh, you know, I drink quite a bit of coffee. And I was like, oh, how much coffee do you drink? She's like, about 12 cups a day. And you know, and it's like the sort of the sort of teaspoon coffee with sugar and milk, you know, just not even nice coffee. And I was just like, you cannot drink 12 cups of coffee a day. That's giving you the tremor. And I was like, reduce your coffee 1 a day over the next week. So she does 11 the next day, 10 the next day, so on and so on. Gets down to 1 coffee, comes back 2 weeks later, the tremor's gone, her anxiety's stopped, and I was like, your treatment's done. don't need any more work. You just need to stop drinking a stimulant that much. So yeah, like I'm not anti-medicine, but I'm anti-stupid. And certainly, there's a time and a place where you just sort of marvel that people don't ask the obvious, and just check in on simple things.
By the way, it's the same, what I was talking earlier about fungus, very true of toe fungus as well. Like so many people have fungal infections on their toenails. And I've had the experience, living in Israel, and it's a hot climate. I was walking barefoot for about 3 years, but overall, I was not wearing shoes much. I was training barefoot. I was a lot on the garden, on the grass, barefoot. There's no way I could get toe fungus because I'm right there in direct sunlight, and even if I'm on damp grass, my feet they get dry very quickly. And people just would wear those very humid shoes and would have this tremendous humidity.
Sorry, man, we lost you for a sec there.
Yeah, we lost each other for a moment there. Saying so very humid shoes and have this tremendous humidity surrounding their feet. So no wonder the fungus grows there in the dark and in the dampness. Like if I had to grow a mushroom, that would be in the dark, in dampness. That's how you grow a mushroom.
Look, we know that there's a significant vitamin D deficiency worldwide. We're indoors more, we're cutting ourselves up in all sorts of creams and makeup and what have you. And, when we see vitamin D drop, there's significant health impacts with that. We do, there's just some, like you say, there's some common sense stuff that just gets missed. And it's one of the reasons why I've gone down the path of utilizing neuroscience in my training in that area to understand our martial arts tradition, because ultimately it's a common sense tradition, and it's so impactful in our health and well-being and in our communities. And if we can sort of really utilize those basic foundational mechanisms, what we see is better resilience in illness. And this is something that I think is super important. If we're using our example of Parkinson's, the reality is that's a degenerative disease, and currently we don't have a complete way of curing that. So what we have to recognize is that resilience in illness is absolutely empowering. And we're not going to empower people by giving them a little blue pill with some dopamine in it and sending them back to their dysfunctional life. We actually have to change who they are. And so this is where martial arts, I think, is really important, because it's not only the posture, breath, mind training and movement. There's also
Sorry about that. We had a small internet malfunction. Pete, please continue.
What I was just offering as we wrapped off there was, for our martial arts community and people that are running classes or clubs and have a community, to really understand that, the culture, the tradition, and the practices that we've inherited are a powerful impact in the health and well-being of our community. It is a medical event that we're also eliciting, not just a martial one, and that you can be of significant help to people who are struggling in their health journey. And as I said, things like resilience and illness, being able to enhance people's sense of well-being, their self-confidence, and target even specific types of disease states can be super impactful in the health and well-being of your community. And I really encourage people to note that is the case, and certainly to be on board with the fact that they're having that level of impact.
All right, so let me ask you this. If you're already telling martial arts teachers all over the world that they are capable of making such profound changes in people's lives and with people's health issues, the problem a lot of these people are facing is that they're not necessarily qualified to make as good a diagnosis as a professional in the field of traditional Chinese medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine has like we said, 28 qualities of pulse diagnosis. The pulses themselves could be taken on several different areas of the body. You can diagnose by the appearance of the tongue, by the inner appearance of the mouth, by the appearance of the eye, the skin, tone of voice. Traditionally, they would do some wacky things. They would taste the patient's urine. That's actually a good diagnosis method, though not common or popular nowadays. There are many ways looking at the hair, listening to the words that are being spoken by patients. But then again, most martial arts teachers, though some of them have an intuitive understanding of this, they don't have the clinical understanding of this. So I would like to ask you, Dr. Pete, could you give us some specific concrete examples of how we can use simple methods of diagnosing some of our students and prescribing for them exercises and types of training which would be appropriate for their situation?
Yes, I think there's two ends to that spectrum. Obviously, when we're looking at complex disease, like, say, a head injury or a neurodegenerative disease, there's a huge amount of diagnostic criteria that a physician like myself wants to take on before we implement a treatment plan. And I'm certainly not suggesting that people should go down that path. That is really a life's journey. But I think that inherently, if we look at particularly, say, our Qigong practices that we have, that most of our systems will have some level of Qigong orientated with it, a lot of the mechanisms inside that are impactful across the nervous system, and certainly can really help people in their health journey. And so absolutely, having confidence just to use what you have and to recognize that you can help people along the way is important. In the context of diagnostic tools, there are some nice books out there that you could potentially go to learn some basics. I think an example like The Foundations of Chinese Medicine by Giovanni is really written for the Westerner. It's written at a level that is consumable by someone who doesn't have medical understanding, and it would give you some basic parameters like what they call the 8 principles. So being able to sort of feed symptoms through those particular parameters, or 5-element concordances. So taking an interest in those areas can be useful, and certainly, as you allude to, it is quite a complex event to be able to create a good diagnosis and a treatment plan. But the other part of it is some of the work that I'm leading into now, with the programs that we're creating for our online therapy. We are actually creating advanced programs for practitioners. And so what we want to do with that is we want people that are running a martial arts club or a Qigong club or a yoga club or something like that to be able to come on and learn a little bit about the science of how that stuff works. So they've sort of got an appreciation for what they're doing. So the first one that we created as an example, our nervous system and emotional optimization program, it's actually based on the 18 breath skills, the Shi, which is a modern medical Qigong system. We've taken only 5 movements out of those 18, and we've targeted one mechanism, one common mechanism that all martial artists will be producing in their own body and in their classes, which is the respiratory vagus nerve stimulation mechanism. And I talked to the science of that, extensively in that course. And what we're trying to do with that is give people enough of an understanding of like, right, okay, the breath work that we're doing is making these changes in the physiological homeostasis of the nervous system, and that is impactful. So I don't think it has to be taken out of the context of your practices or how you do things in a club. It's having an awareness that those benefits are there. I think there's a time and a place where you have to recognize that specialized care is needed. So a good example is post-concussion syndromes. As martial artists, we might be seeing them in our clubs. The reality is certain types of movement, breath work and eye movements can be very impactful in those conditions, but it does have to be specific to the presenting pathological status of the condition. And that is something that requires a higher level of understanding, and I don't think can be easily imported into, say, an online learning platform or into a class or group environment. I think it needs to be more targeted for the individual need.
So
But let's take
if people would like to access those courses, they would be just readily available on your website, right?
Yep, absolutely. We can create a link for you guys to put on your website for that. And you know, my intention is to do this across multiple different areas of our internal medicine. So our internal martial arts. So another example, just to give you a feel for how I use this in clinic, is, you know, most martial arts have a series of stepping practices, right? Obviously, Bhagwajang does, certainly Xing and Tai Chi, multiple different walking techniques. We have a massive worldwide epidemic of balance, gait, and fall prevention-based disorders. You know, arthritis, you know, causes falls to take place. Degenerative diseases often have balance problems. And ultimately, we could be, you know, running our Tai Chi class and just say, like, tonight we're going to do a falls prevention class and just focus on walking techniques. And that's just a simple and easy thing that any martial artist will have in their kit already, that they're utilizing in their training. It's just about recognizing that it can be impactful in that particular area of disease. I mean, Tai Chi is obviously a good example. It's well known for its benefit in arthritis and pain and mobility, and I think most listeners are probably aware of that. But, you know, recognizing that those stepping techniques that you're utilizing in those classes are actually significantly impactful for those diseases and can be done in a reasonably global way without having to go down to the depths of, you know, Chinese medical or biomedical diagnostic techniques.
I want to touch on a very important topic that's right on the border there between medicine and martial arts, which I think is never being discussed, and that is a big problem. It is the issue with blood stasis. I think blood stasis is very common, and blood stasis can be made worse with many types of conditioning exercises in the martial arts, and people are unaware of this. So first of all, I would like to try to amateurishly come up with a definition here, and Pete would help me out if I'm not covering well enough what that means. So blood stasis is a term in Chinese medicine, which means that somewhere, somehow, the blood in your body is not moving as well as it should, or it's stuck. It can be stuck as a clot, or there is just a small pool of blood stuck somewhere, or the body is not moving the blood as much as it should, or maybe there is what is called a blood deficiency, and there's literally not enough blood to be moved around, and because of that, there is not enough blood pressure, not in the sense of blood pressure like the numerical blood pressure, but the pressure that moves the blood around. And then in some areas of the body, all blood stagnates in certain places. Now, blood stasis can be as mild as just having those superficial hematomas, you know, those blood clots, the purple marks under the skin, all the way to more serious blood clots that can shut down internal organs over time, over weeks or months or years or decades, can cause heart attacks, can cause strokes. Blood stasis is a very broad stroke definition for a lot of bad things that can cause when blood is not moving well in the body. And it's involved in countless types of illnesses, including COVID-19. COVID-19, famously among the Chinese medicine community, is known to cause blood stasis in different areas of the body, depending on the person, which is involved with all of the strange symptoms you see with this illness, including loss of smell and loss of taste. All right, and the problem, first of all, Pete, is there anything else you'd like to add to this definition?
Yeah, so I think in the context of blood stasis, we could also categorize it as external and internal. So an external blood stasis is probably going to be something like a trauma, where we're looking at an impact injury or something like that, and we're getting damage to the micro vasculature of the body. So that could be anything like impact injury locally, head injury, something like that. And then we have internal blood stasis, which is really about circulatory dynamics. How is the oxygen and nutrient supply being irrigated around the body? And there are multiple different reasons that can take place. You're right in the context, it's a bit of a broad stroke category, because the reality is that when we give a blood stasis diagnosis, what we have to do is look at the etiology. How did it get like that? So an example would say diabetic neuropathies, where people are getting blood stasis in their legs. That's actually caused by the sugar occluding the blood vessel, and so the blood can't move through it correctly. Blood stasis that maybe is caused by, say, migraines, is a problem with the nervous system and the nerves becoming stressed and squeezing the blood vessels so they can't move freely through the body. So there's many different types, and the term is used broadly across multiple different conditions in that context.
Yeah. So just to make the connection here with martial arts, and just a tip I would like to give listeners who are teaching the martial arts, or even the practitioners, that's really easy. So first of all, the problem is martial arts stress our vascular system and our blood. They tax our bodies. When you train really hard, okay, you have to generate more new blood to replace the old blood. If your body's already taxed and has issues with blood, then maybe intense training would not be good for your body. It might have been very good for you if you're in better health, but not if you have serious issues with blood stasis. Another thing is, in martial arts, we tend to apply physical pressure, either with techniques, kicks, punches, choking, and even if we're gentle, even if it's an Aikido class, and even if it's a gentler type of Aikido, still we're falling to the ground. The ground slams against us or us against it, and that affects blood movement, and that can affect people with blood stasis. And especially in things like judo, when you get slammed quite a bit, and that's a big risk for someone who already has serious issues with blood stasis. So a lot of types of blood stasis are difficult to diagnose, but overall, there are some ways in which you could tell if someone has blood stasis, which are easy, plain to see, so to speak. So blood stasis is characterized by the color purple, purpleness in the body. Obviously, if someone has a purple hue to their skin, okay, that's very suspicious, but that's rare. Typically, it's more internal. So what you would like to do with your students, or with yourselves, if you're not teachers, or even if you are teachers, you'd like to open your mouth and look at your tongue, and preferably do so in a mirror, not for your cell phone if possible, in a mirror, and do so under natural light, okay, not electric light. That's best. And look at the tongue. First of all, if the tongue is purplish, not pinkish, it could be pinkish reddish. Pinkish is good. Pinkish reddish, maybe there's some heat in the body, but these are different things. If the tongue has a purplish tinge, that, first of all, that's blood stasis. You have an issue with blood stasis, you better go see some traditional Chinese medicine practitioner quick. If it got to the point that your entire tongue is purplish, that might be urgent. Now, for most people, you wouldn't see it on all of the tongue's body, but rather you lift the tip of your tongue up and backward, and you look under the tongue. Look directly under the center of the tongue, and also take one of your fingers and push the tongue sideways in each direction, and look at the underside right and the underside left of the tongue, and try to see if you see some purpleness there in the veins that are under the tongue. Now, it sometimes happens that you'd have a little bit, just a tiny bit of purpleness, That could be natural. A lot of people have that. Or maybe you've just been under more physical or mental pressure or otherwise lately. That's all right, just a tiny bit. But if there is well-defined purpleness in the veins under the tongue, especially if there's a lot, then once more, you have to get treatment and you have to reconsider hard training, and especially you have to avoid your body getting hit in the near future until you get treatment, because that could be very detrimental to your health.
Well, if we took your example of Aikido, my teacher, Olatunji, he spent his whole life in Aikido. And, his right shoulder was just full of stasis all the time, just from the constant slamming on the ground. And he actually ended up getting a necrotic bone on the back of his neck, which is an area where blood stasis, the blood supply is not feeding the bone. And he had to have the bone removed.
Wow.
So the reality is, I've
we're
worked with
talking,
a lot of martial artists.
We're talking about someone who's a lifelong martial artist, very hard trainer, very dedicated. Also, he was 6'5" and very, very large. So when he's hitting the floor, he's hitting it with a lot of weight.
Yeah, most certainly is. And I've worked with a lot of martial artists over the year, and the reality is, we're prone to blood stasis, things like iron body training, all that sort of stuff, because blood stasis is also calluses. If you're purposely putting a callus over a joint, and trying to harden that up for a martial arts purpose, I mean, cool, but I can tell you right now, when you're in your 70s, that's going to be full of arthritis. So, think about the long game, not the short game, would be my advice there straight off the bat. But interestingly, in the context of blood stasis and martial arts, I think you hit hit the nail on the head there. We do have a lot of things that we can do externally and internally to manage that. So firstly, from an external perspective, if you are doing conditioning training, you need to have liniments. You want to have something like woodlock or, say, evil bone water or something like that you can be putting on the surface of the skin before and after training, because that's going to warm the area, keep blood supply moving through it. And so there's a whole tradition of Diptaka, the traumatology, and the use of liniments and balms. For a martial artist, I would absolutely have a little kit of liniments, in my training pack. And certainly if I'm doing conditioning work, I'm going to be putting those on before and after, because that significantly reduces the side effects of external stasis from trauma.
Yeah, so what Pete is talking about are traditional so-called wines. Right? Both traditional Chinese medicine and traditional Chinese martial arts. You can brew this wine. You can get recipes online. And make sure you know that you can trust the person you get the recipe from. Okay, that's very important. You don't want to put the wrong plant or animal substance on your skin every day for several years. That can mess you up. So know that you're getting the right recipe, and you can just put all of those herbs and funky animals in a bottle full of high percentage alcohol and brew that for a few months to a few years and use that. You can buy those medicinal wines. There's a colleague of mine, Shifu Dale Dugas. He's making really, really fine liniments as this. His name is Dale Dugas, this DALE space DUGAS. He's got a ton of recipes on his website. So if you want to know which is best for you, you should reach out via email or call him. But otherwise, there's a lot of stuff going on that you can order or buy in the Chinatowns.
And I think traditionally, in martial arts families and culture, traditions of Diptaka would be handed down, through the lineage. So, the teacher would have specific liniments that they like. Maybe they teach a bit of bone setting or massage technique just to sort of soothe an achy joint or something, and respond to the side effects of training, I think, is important. Obviously, in the internal martial arts, there's a strong tradition of Qigong as well, which essentially is really to prepare your body for more physical training. So keeping the joints mobile, oxygenating the body is very important. Basically the best vitamin you can take to stop blood stasis is oxygen. Just breathe that in, because that helps to swell up the blood vessels and improve circulation through the body as well. There's also internal herbal formulas that have been well known for treatment of blood stasis too. That's the sort of thing that I would probably head to a Chinese medical herbalist for, though, because it does need to be specific to the type that you have, and so that's slightly more complicated. I think also in the context of responding to stasis, and it's a big problem that I've seen in the martial arts community, it's really about understanding it also about the importance of recovery. When I was working a lot with mixed martial arts practitioners, they get a little bit of concussion or something like that in a class. Really, you should be taking a minimum of a 14-day rest period after that. You should absolutely not be back in a class again, because your risk of re-injuring yourself and giving yourself a further head injury goes up significantly after an event like that. And of course, if we're talking about recovery from injury, those sorts of things, it's important to remember that martial arts, and particularly in the context of internal martial arts and Chinese culture, is part of a whole family of techniques. Acupuncture, herbalism, tuina, diptyka, qigong, our internal practices, they're all in a reciprocal relationship. So if you're only doing one of those things in your self-cultivation, you might be missing the point a little bit there, because, as I said, movement therapy, like martial arts, is significantly impactful for health and well-being, but it can do harm. And we just have to remember, if something is powerful enough to help you heal, then it's also powerful enough to do harm.
So in your opinion, would you say that in a perfect world, all teachers of traditional martial arts ought to learn at least a little bit of Chinese or Japanese traditional medicine?
Yep, I do. Yep. I know that that's a big ask, but just basic traumatology, like how to make a poultice, how to make a liniment, how to maybe do a little bit of soft tissue massage technique. These are all very, very useful things to have in your toolkit, because at the end of the day, you're working with students. They do get injuries. Let's face it, that happens. And also, if not that, a good referral network. Do you have someone in your club who does know that stuff? Or is there someone in your community who's skilled in those areas? And being able to refer to the right places, I think, is important too.
Yeah. So
and that's not just.
Let's make this. If you're gonna take any one tip whatsoever from this conversation, please make it this one. Make sure you find out who's a legitimate, skilled practitioner of traditional medicine in your area, whom you can trust, and refer your students, friends, and colleagues to, if you cannot do it yourself.
Absolutely critical. This is not only for physical trauma. I've seen people go on retreats and do, say, a 10-day Vipassana meditation, and they go straight to a psych ward afterwards.
Really?
It's just way too much. As I said, something that's impactful enough to be good for our health, therefore can also cause harm. So let's say, for example, that you're running a club and you have a guy come in and they seem quite sort of maybe stressed. They might be a little bit sort of psychologically seem a bit maybe anxious or something like that, and you give them like a fast breathing type technique that you're doing in your class, and they faint, right? You've just overwhelmed their nervous system and put them and compromised their health status. this person then comes back to you the next week and says, hey man, ever since that class, I've been sleepless, I've been restless, I'm feeling uneasy in my body. Essentially, you've caused them to go into a flight and fight mechanism. You need to know how to handle that, you know, and ultimately, if you don't, you need to know someone that you would trust to send them to help settle that down. So it can be psychological as well as physical damage that we're talking about here.
I have a perfect example from my own bitter experience, a disaster I just narrowly evaded. So a while ago, maybe it was 2 years ago, and a veteran student of mine brought in his friend to class. Now, the friend was, I think, 70 years old. He was a professor of Western medicine. And, you know, as often happens, he was very sick with a lot of things. So a really, really lovely human being. And here's the problem. Here comes this guy. He's just a fabulous guy. You have this wonderful conversations with him. You enjoy him so much as a student. He wants to learn. He enjoys learning. But he comes to this first class of his and you see he's a wreck. He's a wreck. He's 70 years old. He's hardly moving. You need to help him up, just stand from the ground. He can't pick himself up, and he's not fit to do martial arts at the moment. He needs physical therapy. Like even qigong would almost be too much. And the guy had diabetes, which he was frank about. But also, I could see that he had those scars on his nose and I think elsewhere on his upper body that I knew from my late grandfather remarks that he had some tumors removed. All right, so like this guy has a very complex health situation which I could not assess. I'm not qualified to do so, but I knew that he's in risk, and I'm at risk trying to teach a person like that because he's not up to learning martial arts at the moment. His body is not gonna handle it. You know, he barely made it through his first class. So, okay, he goes home, and I just didn't have the heart to tell him face to face, you know, you're way too sick for me to help you. Because it's an awful thing to say to a person. We don't want to admonish someone for being very ill. And it's not like he doesn't know he's a professor of medicine. He must know, you know, what his situation is. He understands. Well, all right, but I had to, if I hadn't said something, he would have come to the next class. So eventually, after 2 days, I called him and I really tried to, as politely and compassionately as I could, explain to him that our classes are just not the place to be. He needs to get other forms of treatment. And, you know, I kind of made some suggestions, but I felt like a fool. Like, here's a professor of medicine. He ought to know better than I, you know? and he almost begged to come back. He was so happy, you know, he had so much fun with myself and the other students, and that's what he wanted, but he couldn't. He really couldn't, and he shouldn't have. And I had to make it clear, and we bargained for like 30 minutes over the phone. Eventually, I made it clear that he shouldn't come back. Well, 2 weeks later, the friend who brought him over, my veteran student, said, "Oh, you wouldn't believe what happened to my friend, the professor. He was just walking down the street and he dislocated his knee, walking down the street." And I was like, okay. And then like a few weeks after that, I get another phone call from that same student who brought that professor friend. And he says, "You wouldn't believe what happened to my friend, the professor." I said, "Well, what this time? Is he okay?" "He's in a coma. He might not wake up."
Yeah.
And I put that story in my book, The Martial Arts Teacher, and I'm telling you, is one of those cases when you feel like, I mean, that guy was not in good shape, but I mean, I may have narrowly evaded legal death here.
Yeah, exactly. It's really important. Safety first, you know, and I was staggered by this when I first came into the martial arts world. You know, I remember people doing choke holds and stuff, people fainting, and it was all sort of like, you know, a bit gung-ho and okay. And I reflect back on that, and I'm like, now that I specialize in treating concussion and I've dealt with a lot of head injury over the years, that can change your life. You know, a head injury as a 16-year-old, and then you feel like you recover. 3 years later, you've got depression, learning disorder, you're struggling in your social outcomes. It's because you got knocked out sometime and your brain's changed.
So
So
your
we have to be
your
we have to be
attitude
careful
really
about that.
changes when you have to fix what
Yeah.
you've broken.
Absolutely. I also think just inherently, look, obviously the martial arts, there's risk, and I think everyone is aware of that, but we can mitigate risk with sensibility. You know, going back to our previous conversation, common sense, you know, obviously you do not want the 70-something plus year old guy with diabetes doing low stances and blowing his knee out. That's a bad day at the office for you. So, you know, unfortunately, I do hear about this, you know, the amount of yoga injuries I've treated in my career. Oh, you know, we were doing a headstand and, you know, and now I've fractured my neck. And I'm like, you shouldn't be doing a headstand in your first class. That's just insane. That's poor teaching, and also just not recognizing who you're working with. But I would point out that most of the internal martial arts, you know, if we look at our forefathers, there's ways that they trained in their younger years that were different from how they trained in their elderly years. If we look at things like the large frame forms versus small frame forms, obviously a younger, fitter person is going to do lower stances, be able to extend their body more. Maybe as we age, we can adapt our forms, use them slightly differently. So an example being, as I work with quite a lot of people who have had strokes, and so they can't do vigorous Qigong practices. It's obviously their heart's not in that condition, and they've probably got a physical ailment, but they can do an adapted, slightly different version, maybe in a chair. They can still be moving and they can still be utilizing the techniques. It's just about recognizing where I need to alter and adapt that. You know, I've got another analogy of that, actually. I was teaching last year on a retreat in Bali for 30 days, teaching Qigong. And one of the students was a nurse. And she was like, I'm going to go back. I work specifically in a particular area of medicine, and I'm wanting to implement some Qigong practices in my clinic. And I was like, oh, that's great. You know, I recommend doing these things, da, da, da. She went back home and I got a message from her a wee bit down the track, and she's like, is it normal for people to faint in class? And I was just like, oh, that doesn't sound quite right. And she's like, yeah, you know, I was working with this group and we're about 20 minutes in and the person's fainted. And I was like, don't give that type of group a 20-minute session. They probably need 5 minutes and then a rest. You know, you've got people in post-surgical care here. And so it was just an underestimation of dosage, the amount of time that that person's in training. I mean, the training was still very gentle. It was mainly just breath work with some soft movement, nothing over the top. But for some people, you know, less is more. You know, so in my clinic, as an example, I'll often give people one exercise, just one movement, and then get them doing that well, and then a week later give them another one, and just build it up in layers so that they, you know, don't overcook it and don't cause themselves harm. And also we have to remember as teachers that our students are not practicing only under our supervision. So, you know, you might have the eyes on the prize when they're in class, but when they're out of class, you don't have that. So my experience of, say, Yin Yang Bapa, doing 3 years of static posture, I've never had an injury from it. Never had an injury. And that's because we did the preparatory work correctly. You know, got the postural integration, the toning of the joints, the ligaments and tendons. You know, it was done correctly because they're quite intense postures. And certainly, you know, I've never had any problem with it. But no doubt if you rushed through that first step just to keep people happy and like they're learning something, then you know, the risk factors go up for injury. So perhaps, you know, the sort of inherent curriculum that we've all sort of been given from our teachers over the years, those curriculums are time orientated, and those time orientations are about preparing the body correctly and making sure that you're not overexerting at the early stages of your training. And I think it's important that we we do have a safety first sort of approach for our community as well. And particularly, I think in the modern era, we are often dealing more and more with people in different age groups and different levels of health status. And maybe there needs to be even an initial sort of a questionnaire when somebody onboards into your class. Are you on any medication? Do you have a heart condition? Just some basic questions like that.
I think these things are standard in countries where people like to sue each other.
Yeah, we don't have that in New Zealand.
I think in the United States that's quite common.
Yeah. So I mean, in New Zealand, we don't have that culture here. And as I said, I do see injuries from things where there shouldn't be. That's just the reality of it. And I think that's also very reflective of the modern teaching style. Using yoga as an example, you can go do a 4-weekend sort of teacher training process, then you start your club, and really, let's face it, that's not enough to be proficient, in my opinion, or safe. And certainly my experience with my teachers, they were very keen for you to be well into your training before you started doing any teaching.
What my mentor Stephen tells me, and I think you're familiar with this idiom in traditional Chinese medicine, that in order to be a good doctor, you have to have gone through 3 serious illnesses.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So I think it's same with martial arts. I think martial arts, yoga, it doesn't matter. To be a good teacher, you need that life experience of having gone through difficulties, and not just difficulties in training, difficulties in relationships, difficulties with money, difficulties with you failing yourself and having to rebuild. Someone who's in their late teens, early 20s, typically, usually, unless you're Alexander of Macedonia, you probably don't have that life experience.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. I mean, I've had many people say to me, my magic power in clinic is that I've been sick. Because ultimately, I used to say this when I was teaching medicine. I'll say there's 2 types of students. You have the broken healer and the natural healer. The broken healer is someone who's discovered that they want to be involved in social services and healthcare because they've had an illness and they've had a healing through that. The other type is this type that just naturally arrive at that decision, and they generally don't even know why they're there. And the reality is the broken healer tends to be more cautious and less gung-ho, because they know what it's like to be overtreated. They know what it's like to receive a harmful effect from a medical intervention. And they tend to just be a little bit more sort of conscious of those sorts of outcomes. And so I think you're right there. And for me, I've always thought, I started teaching probably too young, realistically speaking, but I was very blessed in the context of my mentorship with Dr. Yan.
You started your process with and study with Dr. Stephen Yan when you were 22. When did you start teaching?
I was actually teaching. I'd started teaching Twaina that year, and the reason why I ended up with him is because Tunji wanted me to be mentored by him. So basically I would go to his studio. He'd say, this week you're going to teach this, and then I'd go and teach the class. And so I was in a position where I was basically going in too young, in my opinion. And to be fair, when Tunji came to me and said, could you teach? I said no, and he goes, I refuse your no. I want you to do this. So there was a big learning curve.
So because I'm looking at Pete now. He's not looking a day older than 35. How old are you?
43.
Yeah. Nah, 43.
Yeah.
So it's been 21 years, eh?
Yeah. I'm one of those people that's been blessed to sort of live in the preserving jar of internal Chinese martial arts.
Oh, well, I mean, you now have almost exactly double the life experience that you had at 22.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what is uh, 43-year-old Pete, what do you want to say to 22-year-old Pete?
Oh, firstly, I would probably say it's okay to be not good enough.
Hmm.
Because that was really the inherent story that I carried around at that time of my life, which is like, I'm not good enough to do this. But Tunji would always say to me, firstly, you're being mentored to do this. And secondly, you just need to know the next step, and not overthink it. I would say to early Pete, it's okay to be not good enough. And I would probably also would say presence and patience. I was so eager to try and know everything. And I think that's part of that I'm not good enough story, is that you want to prove that you are by knowing too much. And the reality is that much of what we do in internal martial arts and in Chinese medicine is like a fine wine. It needs time to temper. It really truly does, and you just can't rush that. There's no quick way to become proficient. It has to be. There's a time orientation there, and I presume that will continue on for the rest of my life.
And with that, Dr. Pete, would you like to add something else? Give a speech to martial arts teachers and practitioners worldwide, given this opportunity?
Well, I think in the context of our conversation today, I think there's a few highlights that I'd like to remind you all. Our culture, our tradition, and our practices can and are understood with modern neuroscience. We can absolutely peel back the tradition and the practices and understand how they're affecting our nervous system in a medical way. And so that's very exciting. And I know some people are intimidated by that, but I would really employ people to understand that this is an exciting discovery. You're absolutely neuromodulating your brain with your practice. You're creating neuroplastic change, and you should be encouraged by that. Secondly, I'd like to remind everyone that health is not an event. Health is a practice. Yeah. And our practices that we've inherited are part of a way of doing that. The Sheng Yang, nourishing your life. It's a practice. And I think we've inherited some beautiful ways of nourishing our lives. And to recognize that you are absolutely, outside of what you are teaching, impacting the health and well-being of your community, and to be fulfilled by that is something that I would really encourage.
This is a beautiful message. And with that, Pete, I thank you so much for being with us on the podcast today and having this amazing conversation. I'm sure it would be of interest and of aid to a lot of people out there. And I would do my best to bring you on the podcast again sometime in the future.
Absolutely, man. I'm sure there's plenty of topics that we can sink our teeth into. And I just want to thank you also for the great work that you're doing in our community, your literature, focus, and ability to bring us together as a global unity, I think is very, very empowering. And we're very grateful for your work.
Thank you so much. It means a lot coming from you. Being an author is an ungrateful type of work. Some books come easy. To tell you the truth, the martial arts teacher was basically written about my everyday experience. So the first edition I had written in probably 3.5 months. That was a breeze. But research of martial arts had taken me 5 years. Yeah. And you spend 5 years writing this thesis, and you really don't know, how it's going to end up, how it's going to sell, who's going to read it. You got to have that faith in yourself. And I would like to take the opportunity to call upon all of those martial arts practitioners and teachers sitting at home who are compendiums of knowledge, useful knowledge that can really help change the world for the better. But for whatever reason, they keep it to themselves. Maybe they don't want to share with others. Maybe they don't believe that they could share with others. Maybe they're not as skilled in putting that in writing. Well, folks, preservation of these traditions depends on us.
Absolutely.
And we are the current generation. We have to put it out there. There's so many traditions just disappearing nowadays because people say, yeah, you know, I'll write that book next year. It never happens. It never happens. And I tell you what, you know, my advice as an author, imagine you write 1 page a day. Just 1 page, depending on the size of the page, could be anywhere between 350 and 700 words. 350 to 700 words is really not a lot. Or maybe if you imagine you just wrote 1 page every 2 days, you're still going to have a book, or at least half a book by the end of the year. That's really not much. You can do it, folks. And you know what? If you're not going to write those books, you can teach those seminars like our dear friend Dr. Pete here. Or you can put out videos. You can create podcasts. You can be interviewed for podcasts. There's so many ways to share that knowledge beyond your own school or your own clinic. And it's just a shame to keep it to just yourselves or a small group of people who know you. We can bring that knowledge out there, and working together like Pete and I conversing today and putting this out on the internet, this is the way to go.
I agree. And I would really point out, you know, from my experience, because I do work, you know, in our community as a medical physician and utilize the martial arts and Qigong as a massive part of what we do. Small things really count. You know, they really do. Sometimes just having a client just learn a little bit of Dantian breathing while they're lying there can be just absolutely life-changing for them. And so it doesn't need to be the big stuff. You don't need to necessarily learn a complex entire system or anything like that. It can be just showing someone how to tuck their chin a little bit and stretch their neck so that they've got less neck pain. I mean, it can be so subtle. And, you know, my experience is that we can significantly impact the health and well-being of our communities through our culture, our tradition, and the practices that we're utilizing. And I would encourage people to be confident with that. And for those people that are interested in where we're going in the context of having a neuroscientific understanding of these practices, feel free to contact us. I'm obviously building content around that and happy to educate our community from that perspective too. And not to be afraid of it. We're not trying to undo the tradition. We're just having a look under the bonnet and seeing what's going on from a biomedical perspective.
Fantastic. And this one little final question, Pete. If people would like to reach out, we'll definitely include the website in the links below the interview. But would you rather people, if they need to speak with you directly, should they reach out over Facebook or over email?
You'll be able to contact us on email at Neuromedtech, which is our business that we run, and you can join our Facebook page as well. So I'll give you guys all the links to that, and anyone that's interested in our work and looking at neuroscience and Qigong practices and how we use this in clinic. Certainly there are products there in our online therapy page for people that are interested at that level too. So I'll get those links across to you and you can put them up in your group.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Pete, and I'll see you around next time.
Yep. Thanks very much, man. It's been a great conversation and nice to see you face to face.